So welcome everyone to We Are Endurance webinar series. My name, as you know, is Hillary Topper, and today I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Sandra Harrell, who is the swim doctor, and I actually met her on Instagram. She has an amazing Instagram page, and you should definitely follow her if you don't, because she has a lot of tips and strategies on swimming. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Sandra so that she could, tell us how to become more, stronger and more efficient swimmers.
All right. So I was actually thinking that this would be more of like a question and answer discussion type of webinar. With that said, what are some common questions that you as a triathlete have in the triathlete community?
Gee, where do you want to start?
Well, how about this? I'm curious as to hear how many triathletes actually offer or perform some sort of strength program or weightlifting program yeah, you do. Nice. Very good. So a lot of the triathletes that I do coach, they do have some form of strength training. However, oftentimes they lack in, specific exercise prescription. So a lot of the times it's, common exercises they see on social media, like Instagram, for instance, and they kind of build their repertoire of exercises on that. And without truly having a specific training periodization, in terms of the length of their weight program or their strength program, the types of exercises that they include, the parameters that are necessary for their specific event. So, a sprint triathlon versus somebody performing or somebody competing at an Ironman event are going to look completely different in terms of the exercises that they do, as well as the exercise prescription, as well as, pre-habilitative as well as rehabilitative exercises that they should be including as well. So oftentimes I see a lot of what's common is, sets of 12 or sets of 10, the 3 sets of 10 with every exercises, or, 3 sets of 12, or, sometimes I see some athletes that come to me and they, I ask them, oh, what does your strength program look like? And they'll say, oh, I do 20 reps of every exercises. And they'll have, anywhere from 10 to 15 exercises in their lifting. And so I ask them, okay, how long are you in the gym for? Like, how often do you dedicate specific strength training to that, as well as, the duration, as well as like the frequency, right, of going to the gym, in addition to, training on the bike, as well as running, as well as swimming. So oftentimes, swimmers, the swimming aspect, unless you are already a swimmer, who is proficient at it, swimming leg tends to get a little bit left out a little bit, as well as strength training. So those two areas, yes, it is a sport that involves 3 different athletic capacities. However, there's that missing fourth one that we'll tend to forget, which is strength training. And it's having a specific coach, to help you get through it, just like how you would have a coach for cycling, a coach for swimming, a coach for running, the same thing is required for strength training. Yes.
So Sandra, why don't we just take us back and share with us your background and what you actually do. And then I have a bunch of questions from what you just said. So let's just let's go back.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry about that. I totally jumped into it and forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Dr. Sandra Harrell. I have my doctorate from UCSF, and this was in physical therapy. So my training primarily is in rehabilitative sciences, as well as just, helping people recover from injuries. And then, so I have my master's in exercise science and health promotion and my bachelor's in psychology. So I utilize all three of my degrees and my expertise to help swimmers as well as athletes, triathletes, with a more holistic and comprehensive approach towards their training as well as recovery, And so oftentimes people think of training as, something that's isolated to what you're just doing on the bike, what you're doing in the pool, and what you're doing, running on land, or treadmill, as well as, sometimes also what you're doing in the weight room for those that do participate in a strength program. However, we tend to forget about all the other hours of the day, that we're not training, right? So if you're dedicating anywhere from 2 to 4 hours a day, training for your triathlon or Ironman event, what about the other 20 hours a day if you're training 4 hours a day, or 18 hours, however long that you're not training? What are you doing in that time to help facilitate your peak performance for that specific event for the year? So that is kind of where I come in, and I help with that recovery aspect as well as that performance aspect to help optimize triathletes in and out of the water.
So some of the people on this call are runners who want to get into swimming, and others are triathletes and have done Ironman events. What would you recommend for someone, now that diverse group? What are some of the exercises that you would recommend to get stronger in the swim?
Okay, so specific pull exercises or exercises in the gym that help with pull?
Correct.
Both.
The exercises in the
Right.
gym. Yeah, I guess
In
both.
the gym. Okay. Yeah. So a lot of, if you have not had much experience in the pool and you're looking to improve your stamina as well as strengthen the pool, a lot of that, a lot of swimming requires a lot of back and core stability. Okay, so common saying is, proximal stability allows for distal mobility, right? And so swimming is a full body workout. You really do utilize, your head, neck, arms, chest, abs, hips, all the way to, your ankles. And so having a strong core, which includes, your abdominal muscles, as well as your hip musculature, as well as, your back, your extensors, your trunk extensors, your erector spinae and such, that all helps facilitate a stronger, stable base for swimmers. Okay, so oftentimes what I'm seeing is, especially those even experienced swimmers, really, they often train by isolating, really pulling hard and kicking hard, right? Those are really what most people think of. You got to pull hard, you got to kick hard, and you got to do that for a long time, right? However, that's, while there is some truth to that, there is a lot that's missing in terms of cross-body connection and, coordination. So everything that kind of connects your limbs together, right? So everything in between that you need to improve. So a lot of these exercises will include various, shoulder stability exercises. You see like, prone, incline, bent over, T's, W's, Y's. Those are very common swimming exercises that are local to the shoulder girdle as well as the back. But a lot of foundational lifts that include some sort of squat movement, some sort of press. So push, pull, press are your foundational movements that I highly recommend, every triathlete integrate, and so the foundational movement patterns include squatting, lunging, pressing, pulling, just yeah, so a lot of those movements. And so you can see there are variations of all those movements that you can perform in terms of upper and lower body that you do want to integrate.
So there's someone who's coming on the call. He should be here any minute, but he tends to swim and it's almost like instead of being straight, his legs kind of,
Drop off.
okay. Now with somebody like that, what would you recommend to kind of keep their body level when they're swimming?
Yeah. So oftentimes swimming is a very technical sport. And very minor movements will produce very large movement patterns. So it's a sport of subtlety, really. Um, and so somebody whose legs are sinking, particularly in freestyle, um, what happens is that they are swimming at an uphill. And so rather than it being in that horizontal plane, what they need to focus on really is adjusting their head position. So you would never have thought that, if your legs are sinking, most people try to just kick harder, right? And try to just manually bring their legs up towards the surface. But you're kind of fighting that, because your lower body, your legs are really, they are your largest musculature. They're the heaviest part of your body. Okay. So when you're trying to fight that, you're actually expending a lot more energy in a very futile manner. So what we need to do instead is actually adjust your head position and kind of gently press your head down and your chest down, because there's something called a head-hip relationship in terms of biomechanics. And so what goes up, the other must come down, right? So if your head is up, which for most swimmers, that's the case, then what has to happen at the hip level? Then the hips have to drop to accommodate a high head position. And so in order to address legs that are constantly sinking, you're going to have to press your head down into the water, and your hips will naturally rise towards the surface. And so that's going to help with addressing legs that sink, or somebody who constantly swims at an incline. And so, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about shoulders now. Okay. So, I mean, obviously, you should be really focusing on your lats to pull. You know, so what do you do, or what kind of exercises can you do to alleviate some of the shoulder pain that's associated with swimming?
Yes, absolutely. So shoulder pain is very general in its diagnosis. And there can be multitude of things that result in shoulder pain, right? So you can have general impingement, you can have bicep tendonitis, you can have rotator cuff tendonitis that can either include supraspinatus or subscapularis or infraspinatus as well. Tears, general scapular dyskinesis is one as well, where the shoulder blade doesn't move properly to help facilitate what the shoulder joint should be doing. So all these different injuries and conditions are a result of improper strength training and rehab and prehab training. So yes, developing lats actually are fairly strong in most swimmers, just because the movement pattern of freestyle specifically, you end up developing your lats fairly well. What actually needs to develop a lot more actually is what's happening in between the shoulder blades, kind of your upper mid back region. So muscles such as your rhomboids, your middle trapezius, your lower trapezius, those tend to be underdeveloped. Some would say they're like, not inactive, but they're not as strong as they need to be compared to other muscles such as your pectoralis, as well as your lats, your upper trapezius, your levator scapulae. All those muscles tend to be hyper developed versus some of the other ones that I had mentioned. So exercises that help facilitate a more balanced musculature, and to prevent some of those injuries would be a lot of like the T's, with the emphasis of, keeping your shoulder blades down, and drawn essentially into your back pocket, with that visualization, keeping your shoulders down away from your ears and really squeezing your shoulder blades together. So a lot of scapular retraction type exercises are helpful. A lot of exercises such as like Ys, with dumbbells, with various types of weights or pulleys or resistance bands, can help facilitate stronger
Could you show us,
lower.
just demonstrate a why, like what exactly is, can you just show
Yeah.
us?
So a Y, yeah. So Y looks exactly what the exercise is. It's essentially bringing your hands up into this Y position while keeping your shoulders down and away from your ears, drawing, your shoulder blades behind you together and downward into like that back pocket, back pant pocket kind of thing.
Do you
So
do it with weights?
yep, you can do that with body weights. For a lot of my athletes, they are very muscular, they're very strong. However, they are unable to do exercises as simple as that because it requires specific movement patterns, So a lot of the times their lower trapezes is actually very, very weak. It's compensated by having large lat muscles, All these other bigger muscles, they tend to overtake and they tend to be overutilized. And so these smaller muscles in between your shoulder blades that pull your shoulder blades back and together, as well as down and together, those tend to be neglected, not on purpose, but just because bigger muscles are going to overpower some of these little ones. So you can do that with body weight, just, the weight of your arm and your hands tend to fatigue a lot of these smaller muscles naturally. So you build your stamina on that, right? You start with body weights, then you start with maybe 1 pound weights, 2 pound weights, and then you slowly work your way up. A lot of these exercises, they don't require you to be lifting 50 pounds to do these exercises. You actually cannot. I don't see anybody who would be able to do exercises like that effectively. They can probably do it to compensate, right? But again, you're compensating. You're not properly doing these exercises if you're utilizing very, very heavy weights. So yeah.
Yeah, when I had gone to a physical therapist and she was showing me how to properly do a deadlift, and I never
Mm-hmm.
really thought that I'd have to curve my back when I lean
Mm-hmm.
over. I always I kind of like hunch over. So
Mm-hmm.
that was a big aha moment for me. With some of these other exercises that you propose, we do. Is there a specific posture that we should concentrate on?
So a lot of these, it depends on the exercise, but oftentimes, I tell a lot of my athletes to start with like a neutral spine, right? So you want to start with a neutral spine, protect your back, engage your core, which includes your full abdominal muscles, your erector spinae. It also includes your pelvic floor. Most people actually do not think about engaging their pelvic floor, and that's actually really critical, both for women and men, really, especially with, an aging population where the pelvic floor tends to be a little bit weaker. We actually want to think about engaging your pelvic floor as well when doing these lifts, specifically, like, for example, deadlifts. You do want like a flat back. There will be some rounding that's natural when you start lifting very, very heavy weights. However, if you're lifting light weights, I do recommend learning to hinge at the hips, having the mobility through your hips and your knees and your back really to properly perform deadlifts, because most people, they round their back, for several reasons. One, because they don't, it's not a familiar movement pattern. So there's a lot of neuromuscular reeducation that is required to perform that exercise. But oftentimes it's also a mobility thing too. Most people have very tight hips. All right. We're often sitting in a chair 8, 10 hours, 12 hours a day, depending on your work demands. Um, and so a lot of the muscles end up getting tight in certain areas, lengthened in other areas, very stiff. And so you create that rounding low back posture that, essentially, if you continue with that and you try to lift heavy weights in that position, it's damaging, it's very, you risk injuries doing that. So postures, typically neutral spine, trying to protect your back. Something that most people don't think about is actually tucking your chin in too. All right. So what you're doing, because your spine is all connected, right? So what you do in your head, neck region, your cervical spine, that's going to impact what your lumbar spine or your low back is going to do. So oftentimes I tell a lot of my athletes, think about tucking that chin in, kind of like making a double chin, but that will help stabilize your neck up top. And that helps you and forces you to also engage a lot of your chest musculature. And then that naturally also engages your abdominals too. Okay.
So before I'm going to open this up, but I'm going to stop talking and asking questions. But before, you had talked about when you do an Ironman, a half Ironman, or just even starting out as a swimmer, what would you recommend? What is your prescription for for strength training? Like how many times a week? How long should you do it?
Yeah. So if you're just starting out and you're preparing for big events such as those, generally I tell a lot of my athletes, start with twice a week. Start with twice a week and start with, anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes a session. Do a proper warm up, 10-minute warm up with some dynamic stretching. All right. And then make sure you do cap it with a cool down at the end. But in terms of in the middle, like the meat of the strength training session, I tell a lot of my, athletes, if they've never had any experience with lifting, start with, 4 to 5 lifts. That's more than enough. Even for an experienced, triathlete who does lift, generally 5 to 6 lifts is really all that I would cap it at, So if you're new, start with 4 and then work your way up to 5, and then eventually to 6. And then the exercise prescription in terms of like the sets and reps, that's going to depend on where you are in your training cycle, how far away that event is. If you're preparing a year in advance, your exercise prescription in terms of your parameters for sets and reps and intensity will vary compared to somebody who is maybe 6 months out versus 3 months out, 1 month out, weeks out. So there's a taper cycle as well too, as well as rest periods that are built in to help facilitate. But generally, I tell a lot of my athletes, start with motor control and movement pattern and endurance reps. So that's usually less sets, higher reps, less rest. Okay. That's for my athletes who are like a year out to 6 months out, and then from there, we start to integrate, strength specific exercise prescription for those that are looking for hypertrophy as well. That's also a different type of exercise prescription. If your goal is to develop strength versus muscular endurance, your strength prescription is going to be higher or more sets, less reps, more rest at a higher intensity. So heavier weights that'll build strength. Lighter weights build endurance as well as more reps. Sorry. And then you also want to think about including, some sort of power prescription too at some point within your training periodization, because you do want, most people think like, oh, you're an endurance athlete. Why do you need power? You just want to maintain the entire time. And while that is true for the majority of the race, you do want to, if you want to get ahead of the pack, it's explosive. You have to have power. You have to have kind of that sprint capacity. And so integrating plyometrics, integrating power training is going to be important for those aspects, as well as finishing a race too, right? Most people are going to ramp up the last, 500 meters or, last couple of miles of running as well as cycling. So having the ability to essentially switch gears, and to go from endurance and holding a pace to sprinting and power generation at the end is going to be really important to program into.
Interesting. All right, I'm gonna stop asking questions. I'm gonna start opening up to everybody else.
Sure. So I have a question. I've been, everything that I had read, about a triathlete's training cycle, when I was talking about building strength, it was focused mostly your strength workouts in the off season. And then as you go into your training cycle, say for your main event, whether it's 19, 16 weeks, whatever, then you go into more of a maintenance cycle. But what you're describing sounds more like strength workout should be an equal part of your run, your swim, your bike, and that it will follow a very similar cycle to your training program, where again you have rest periods and everything. Is that correct?
It's
Okay.
essentially your fourth sport. It's the invisible fourth sport that
Got it.
helps with injury prevention.
Got it. Okay. And then obviously it depends exactly, this is highly customizable because it depends on, what's your strong leg, what's your weak leg, what particular do you need to work on in any particular event. But
Exactly.
but if you were to just in general say, how much time on average should you be putting into strength work once you're actually into your regular training cycle?
Honestly, I think something as much as twice a week for 45 minutes to 60 minutes tops is more than enough. Twice a week. That's all you really need. You don't need more than that. Some people do 3-4 times a week. It's a little bit of overkill. You can't integrate that. It just depends, right? Like if you are going to do twice a week, I recommend, making the most out of those twice a week sessions, If you're going 4 times a week because your schedule allows for it, and, your training allows for it, you program that into your training cycle, then, that's great too. But I would recommend going maybe doing less exercises per session. Maybe you don't do 5 to 6 sessions or 5 to 6 lifts per session. Maybe you do 3 to 4, maybe you do just 2 to 3, so essentially you really just need 2, because you're not lifting, as that's not part of your competition, right? Lifting is really to help supplement everything that you're doing in the pool, while running, and while on the bike. It's to make sure that your body is performing optimally, and avoiding some of those overuse, overtraining injuries. So that's how I see strength training. It has an equal part in its importance. However, its purpose is more kind of like the behind the scenes, thing. So you want to make sure that your capacity for cycling, running, as well as swimming is optimized, and you do so by making sure that you're tweaking and fine-tuning all the smaller muscles that you need to strengthen in order to be able for your larger muscles to perform at its peak.
Got it. And when you're prescribing a strength program, are you looking at that athlete's overall training program? And is it so, like, if there's a heavy week on all the other 3 disciplines, do you have a light week for strength and then vice versa?
It kind of depends on where they are in their training cycle. I also really take into account, you know, their recovery level as well as, you know, their readiness score. So a lot of my coaching is done in app. And at the beginning of every lift session, I
Mhm.
have them, you know, rank or rate their, you know, level of soreness on a 1 to 5, their stress, their sleep, their mood. Um, and so that kind of gives me an idea how ready they are to tackle, you know, that particular strength session.
Mhm.
Uh, and, you know, if I'm noticing like a downward trend where the readiness score is like a 2 out of 5 rather than, you know, 5 out of 5 being completely ready to go, you know, then that tells me that this person they may be overtraining, either that, um, for, you know, what they are able to handle with work and just life in general, you know. And so with that, then I would tone down their strength program so that it help facilitates all the other training that they have to do. Because, you know, you have a specific program, you know, to follow in terms of like your cycling, swim, and run in order to be able to complete all those distances, right? And let alone, you know, doing personal bests.
Mhm.
So those are kind of your necessary training. Strength it's supplemental in that regard, you know, because you don't necessarily need it, but you're going to need it in the long run if you want to be healthy, you know, and
Well, yeah, I'm thinking of it in terms of, once you get into your 50s and 60s, now it's an especially important thing,
Mhm.
regardless of whether or not you're doing triathlon or, endurance swimming or whatever. It's just an important part of any 50 or 60-year-old
I
person's.
actually recommend it, you know, it's equally important for those in their 30s too, because
Yeah.
especially women, you know, our bone density starts to drop at 30, you know, and
Mhm.
it drops a percentage every single year that we age, you know, just because of hormones, you know, and so women are more likely to become osteopenic and osteoporosis, you know, have osteoporosis
Right.
because of bone density issues. So strength training for women is extremely important, you know, in their 30s. Um, and as well for men, you know, in their 30s going into their 40s, because a lot of metabolic changes occur around that time too. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the beginning of this session, you talked about push, pull, and press. Those are the three exercises we should focus on.
Mhm.
Can you give us examples of each?
Yeah, absolutely. So something that would be pushing would be like a squat, right? You're pushing the weight up, right? So that's an example. Something that is an example of press would be like dumbbell overhead presses or doing like a bench press, you know, on your back. And then push pull press. So a pull, an example of a pull type movement would be your deadlifts. You're pulling a weight off the ground. So those would be kind of like your foundational lifts, you know, some sort of squat, some sort of deadlift, you know, and some sort of pressing movement, you know, whether it's bench pressing, overhead press, incline press, you know, a lot of different types of pressing movements. I would those would be like the meat of your program. And then you add accessory lifts to that to supplement areas that, you know, this particular athlete is, you know, weaker in. Maybe they're weaker in their hamstrings, maybe they're weaker in their like hip external rotators, you know, then you add some of those and that becomes like the salad, you know, the dressing to
Mhm,
help a more comprehensive program.
mhm. Okay. Any questions? Craig, I put you on the spot before. We were talking about
No, no, no.
we were talking about your body position in the water,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and Sandra was saying that there's specific exercises that you can do to lift up so that you're more level.
Okay. Do you mind sharing those exercises? Sandra, again, hello everyone. Sorry about being late. But if you could share some of those exercises, I would definitely be open. That's part one. And then part two is you talk about the lifting piece of it, the push, pull, press. Um, Large muscles, small muscles. Can you give a little bit of descriptions in terms of some of those small muscles, especially around your feet, ankles, right? And for me, even like the shoulders.
Okay, sure, absolutely. So first thing I want to address were some of those exercises, right, for
Mm-hmm.
maintaining a more horizontal body position. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of that is actually technique work, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's adjusting your body position in the water. You actually want to think about pressing your head down gently, and
Mm-hmm.
that will lift your hips up because there's something called the head-hip relationship, you know. And so with that, it's essentially what goes up, the other end must come down. So if you are a type of swimmer who is looking up, you know, which is necessary, right? If you need
Mm-hmm.
a spot, if you're doing open water, if your swim leg is open water, you definitely need a spot. However, when you lift your head up, your hips have to come down. And when your hips
Mm-hmm.
come down, your legs end up sinking. So to
Mm-hmm.
correct that without actually implementing any more energy or expending any energy, you just gently press your head down, eyes look down, press your chest down, and your hips are naturally going to sink. Your hips are naturally going to rise towards the
Right.
surface of the water. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so that's an easy way to fix it. Um, and that's without really doing anything, you know, no
Mm-hmm.
need to lift, no need to swim any harder. You just adjust your body position whenever you feel like your legs are sinking.
Okay.
Um, and
Now,
then
are
the
there,
second question, go on.
going back to that, I understand the relationship in the hip and the head, but are there any other, in terms of the gym around that, in terms of strengthening your core and your back? Any recommendations there?
Absolutely. So things are all kind of connected. I do recommend, you know, in terms of when you're lifting, it's more of a positional thing. So with any lift that you're doing, think about tucking your chin down a little bit. Okay. So some people like to think about doing like a double chin, you know, tucking that
Mm-hmm.
chin down. Imagine you have a tennis ball, all right, and you have the tennis ball right here between your chin and your clavicle. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
top part of your chest. All right. And you want to think about gently holding that tennis ball right there. Okay. And so what happens is that if you let go, a lot of the times when people are lifting, they extend their neck, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to drop that position. This position where you're extending your neck, that's also what's going to drop your legs too. Okay. So
Okay.
when you're lifting, engaging your deep neck flexors. Okay.
Okay.
And allowing you to engage this will help kind of cue your body position together. Okay. So if you are deadlifting, for example, think about holding that tennis ball right there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If you are bench pressing, right, on your back, think about tucking that chin down, engaging your deep neck flexors, and then
Mm-hmm.
pressing up. All right. Squats are a little bit different, right? Because you're squatting, especially with like a back squat, if the barbell is
Mm-hmm.
behind you on resting on your upper traps, then
Mm-hmm.
when you're squatting down, you're going to have to go into that neck extension just because
Mm-hmm.
the position of your spine is going to go into lordosis, you know. So that is probably one movement where, you know, it's like, okay, you can't really engage
Mm-hmm.
your chin as much, you know, because you do
Mm-hmm.
want to make sure your eyes are forward. However, there are people that do, you know, perform with their eyes down and engage their chin, and you can totally do that too. It just will affect what your squat looks like, right? So,
Understood. Okay.
yeah.
And then with regard to the smaller muscles, in terms of because as we're thinking about this, running, biking, swimming, the impact is I'm noticing it on my ankles more, especially the running and biking, somewhat in their hips,
Yeah.
and shoulders. Any suggestions in terms of
Yeah. So,
exercises?
absolutely. So first and foremost is making sure that your shoes are fitting you, right? But the thing with
Hmm.
shoes, and you know, we wear shoes all the time. So what's
Hmm.
tough is that a lot of our toe flexors, you know, our toe flexors tend to be weaker because
Hmm.
we're not really barefoot running most of the time, you know? And so that actually gets weaker. That's going to affect everything up the chain, right? It's that interregional dependence that occurs. And so You start with your toes. Some exercises that you can do to improve some of like your toe flexors, as well as some of like the stabilizers in your feet are, doing like towel scrunches, having like a towel on the floor, your bare feet, whether you're at work or at home, wherever you want to be, and you essentially, you keep your heel down and you lift your toes up and you're essentially trying to pull the towel towards you with your toes, with all 5 toes. And that's going to help engage some of those toe extensors that you need to have proper form. Okay. Another good example would be like your abductor muscles. All right. Your toe abductor muscles. A lot of the times we don't think about splaying out our toes or scrunching them, right? Most of the time they're forced to be scrunched because they're in shoes all day. So working on abducting your toes will help to strengthening some of your feet muscles. That's one thing. A lot of people actually, a lot of runners have very strong calves, right? For endurance muscles, just because you have to run all the time. A lot of the time people don't think about strengthening their tibialis anterior. Okay, so the dorsiflexion, flexing your toes towards your face, that muscle right in the front where your shins are. You need to strengthen that as well. Okay, and that's an endurance muscle as well that you would need to improve on. That's with the feet, the ankles, as well as, some of like the fibularis. All right, so everting your feet out, right? So that's going to be really important too, just for general ankle and knee health too, just because you need all of those muscles to perform together and optimally for injuries to be minimized. So strengthening that, just kind of everting out and holding that and slowly bringing it down. You can always use like a lightweight, like an ankle weight, and then strap it on like the top of your foot. And then in a side lying, when you in a side lying position, you lift it against gravity, and that'll help strengthen that as well. And then now moving up the chain, so like your knees, your hips, right? So oftentimes as a cyclist, your quads are going to be overdeveloped, right? Same with runners. Runners tend to have very, very strong quads. There are also 4 muscles in quads. Your hamstrings, you only have 3 muscles. So you're working against 4 in the front, 3 in the back. All right. What do you think is probably going to need more help with? Probably the ones that only have 3 in the back. And, they tend to be not neglected, but they are kind of, on the back burner. So you want to definitely strengthen your hamstrings. A lot of those exercises you can do at the gym with machines, like seated hamstring curls are great. You can do both legs at the same time. If you notice you have a strength deficit on one side versus another, say you had an injury, and so that side tends to be a little bit atrophied, a little bit weaker, then you can also do single leg seated hamstring curls on that too. Same goes with prone. If you can tolerate the position, and most people can, prone hamstring curls, I think, are just as good because you are not lengthened at the hip. So your hamstrings are actually connected at your pelvis as well as the knee. So it bends and it flexes in 2 joints. And so when you're seated at your hips, you're really just, flexing and training that muscle belly, in the middle and near the knees. However, when you're prone, it allows it to be in a shortened position so you can engage your hamstrings a little bit more. That utilizes kind of that pelvis attachment. So those are 2 easy ways that, are equipment friendly, or machine friendly, Another great exercise that I really like are hamstring curls on a stability ball. That taxes your core and your glutes surprisingly a lot. I see a lot of very, very strong, very, very athletic athletes that have trouble doing that because it's a lot of it is a stability thing, and so after a while they are able to work their way up, but just introducing that exercise for the first time, a lot of people have trouble just balancing on a stability ball without even curling your hamstrings in and out. Just being in that hip bridge position throws them off, So that's a great exercise to do. And then if you can, Nordic hamstring curls are great, but that tends to be one of the most challenging hamstring exercises. And so a way to regress, or to modify that exercise is to, one, make sure you have somebody to hold your feet down, right? So Nordic hamstring curls is one where you're kind of in tall kneeling, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And you either, hook your heels on like a couch or a machine to stabilize your ankles down or have somebody hold them down. And what they do is you have to slowly lower yourself down into like kind of a push-up position, and then you push yourself back up. So it's that eccentric motion as well as concentric motion that people have a hard time doing, because you're essentially your body weight is your weight.
Right.
And so it's an extremely difficult exercise to do. However, in order to train that, you got to make sure you're engaging your core, your body is straight, your hips are straight, right? Going down and all the way up. You use a lot of resistance bands. So you have your partner essentially kind of anchor the resistance band around them and then around your chest. And then that will help slow you down without having to flop, control your descent.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's another exercise, but that tends to be a very, very advanced exercise. And that's something that, you can work up to eventually. But all the other exercises that I suggested are great, that anybody can perform immediately and, without being discouraged, and so.
Okay. Thank you.
So,
Thank you. Thank you. So Dr. Sandra Harrell is on Instagram, The Swimmer's Doc. It's at The Swimmer's Doc. Okay. And in this, she has so many amazing exercises on her page. So if you follow her on Instagram, you will get these amazing exercises. Plus, she has a link tree there where she does one-on-one strength and technique coaching, nutrition coaching, and then she's got the app that she talked about earlier, strength and mobility training for swimmers. She's got a newsletter. She's got it all. So check out her link tree. Go to her page on Instagram. Definitely give her a follow. And you could contact her as well on the page. So I think that's probably the best way to contact you, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, without further ado, I know it's like coming to the hour. If anybody has any last final questions, we could take them. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
having me. This has been so much fun.
It's
thank
great.
you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Really informative. All right. Have a good day, all.
Take care. Have a great weekend.